Chapter 8. The following day, Bullet at last did what he had promised to do at our first meeting. He took me round his domain himself. I would, he had told me, see things which few other people had seen before me, and he kept his word with a vengeance. Nevertheless, when we first set out, and I took my seat in the Land Rover with Patricia, Cahoro, and 2 rangers, I had no great hopes that this morning's trip would produce any fresh revelations. After having trekked through the reserve behind a small girl who knew all its wild secrets, I thought there was nothing left to find out which could really surprise me. I fancied I was becoming blasé about the place. How utterly mistaken I was, and with what delight I learned very quickly the full extent of my error. To begin with, there was the Land Rover itself, innocent of roof and windows, open on all sides, exposed to wind and weather, a vehicle specially designed for maneuvering over the worst possible kind of terrain. There was the tough, authoritative, relaxed way in which Bullet drove. There was his obvious knowledge of every square inch of ground we traversed, the fruit of countless expeditions, inspections, and miscellaneous journeys, his daily labors over many years. Above all, there was Bullet himself, or rather, that basic element in him which made possible his wholehearted and total absorption in that unique profession of his choice, a profession for which his mighty body and big, leonine head seemed specially designed and predestined. I looked at his huge, square shoulders, his massive neck, bare above the open-necked shirt, and the thick lips, parted a little now by the wind, that whipped back as we sped along. He was driving me into the singing morning as though we were off to conquer a new world. At this moment, everything belonged absolutely to Bullet, and he knew it, and took it for granted. The car, obedient to his every touch, the rangers, whose devotion to him was unswerving, and whose savage, childish laughter rang out whenever a violent swerve or bump threw them about like black jumping beans. And Patricia, she sat snuggled up close against her father, as though to catch something of his warmth and vigor for herself. Her small face was whipped clean by the rushing wind. Again and again she pulled me by the arm, or winked knowingly, in order to make me admire the skill and audacity of those great tough hands that held the steering wheel. And lastly, the bush, in all its manifold aspects, league upon league of plant and animal life, stretched out beneath the tutelary protection of Kilimanjaro. All the bush was Bullet's to the uttermost horizon. From time to time, Bullet would fling the Land Rover at the side of some steep hill, forcing it like a rearing horse up an incredibly steep gradient, thrusting on to the summit, where a limitless panorama unrolled far beneath us. It was like being airborne. Sometimes, again, he would plunge down into dark, overgrown, rock-cluttered gorges, for all the world like the ocean bed in their sebaceous coralline gloom. Then, abruptly, we would burst out into the freedom and sunlight of the savannah, and see ahead of us the vaulting ribs of some great tropical forest. Nothing, perhaps, could equal those strange secrets I had learned during my journey with Patricia, but it was just as true that I could experience nothing quite like the fantastic tour on which Bullet was now taking us. Patricia's tender years, which incidentally formed the basic ingredient of her queer power, combined with her obsession over King and my own fascination with her, removed that part of the reserve which she had shown me to the realm of mystery and legend. But Bullet stripped off the veils of mystery, opened every secret door, laid out the whole national park at my feet in its full majestic splendor. I quickly lost even the most elementary sense of orientation. I had no idea which way we were going, and I did not care. On through secluded patches of veld we sped, with thick jungle all around, through narrow clearings shaped like a crescent moon, past clumps of gigantic trees, and scattered fields hemmed in by forest, a confused, overlapping kaleidoscope of impressions which resolved themselves finally into one rich, variegated landscape, at once wild and countrified, blending in itself elements of savagery and gentle rural peace. What had this landscape to do with such prosaic matters as the points of the compass? The morning sun shone down on this rolling sea of greenery, highlighting the bright tints, deepening the shadows, creating a fine chiaroscuro from nodding grasses and wind-blown foliage. All around, like submarine reefs, the summits of long-dead volcanoes thrust up toward the light, crowned with a black foam of petrified lava. I looked in vain for any villages or small settlements. There was not one solitary hut to send its thin thread of friendly smoke up into the sky, not a visible trace, not so much as the scent or shadow of human habitation had ever invaded this primal privacy. Since the dawn of time, the only creatures to be born and die here, to hunt, mate, and make their homes in this wilderness, had been wild animals. Nothing had ever changed. The beast, like the land itself, remained faithful to the ways of that primeval epoch, and Bullet, a huge red-headed sorcerer, conjured them all up in the magic circle of his furious driving. Bucking and jolting, plunging down one steep slope and charging up the next, urged on at its maximum speed, the Land Rover tore round each herd, closer and closer all the time, till at last they stampeded away into the bush and vanished over the horizon, a jostling mass of fury bodies and horned heads. Panting, ecstatic, nearly choking with sheer delight, Patricia would shout, "Look, look! Aren't they wonderful? Just watch the speed of those zebras. See how high the antelopes can jump. And those buffaloes, charging along, straight as arrows." She gripped my hand, as though to instill into me something of her own absolute conviction and said, "My father's an old friend of all these animals. They know us well. That's why we can play games with them." Was it possible that Bullet, so harsh with anyone else who disturbed the peace of his precious beast, in the slightest degree, actually shared his daughter's ingenious beliefs? Did he suppose that the very rigor and vigilance with which he enforced that peace gave him the right to disturb them occasionally on his own account? Or was this no more than an instinctive urge which he was quite unable to control? Whatever it was, the sport continued, getting a little rougher all the time. Particularly, I remember our encounter with the elephants. We came on a whole herd of them, 40, perhaps even 50 in all, down at the bottom of a valley, spread out round a small pool of clear water. This pool seemed to be fed by one of those miraculous springs that sometimes are to be found in the bush, and Bullet had cleared a channel for it, and hollowed out a kind of shallow basin to catch its flow. Some of the elephants were browsing on the nearby slopes, pulling down bunches of leaves with their trunks. Others were wallowing about in the pool itself. The calves were playing together, frisking and butting. Occasionally their mothers would siphon up a trunkful of water and squirt it all over them. The leader of the herd, a huge solitary figure, his tusks yellowed with age, stood keeping watch over his tribe like some great granite monolith. He did not budge an inch as he saw our car coming toward him through the trees. How could this buzzing insect, with other insects on its back, threaten or disturb his omnipotent tranquillity? But the Land Rover roared closer and closer, bouncing from hole to hole, from hillock to hillock, weaving in and out, rattling noisily between one family group and the next. The young ones took fright, and then the old bull's trunk went up and back, and the peaceful bush was shattered by a sound more shrill and resonant and terrifying than the simultaneous blast of 100 trumpets in battle. The whole herd at once formed up round their leader, the males behind him, and the females slightly to one side, standing protectively over their calves. Bullet stopped the Land Rover immediately in front of the elephants. They were drawn up in a solid phalanx, shoulder to shoulder, their great backs heaving and their trunks writhing about like so many angry snakes. Bullet waited till the air was split by a chorus of angry trumpetings, waited till the whole vast mass heaved forward like a wave. Then he swung the Land Rover round and shot off at full speed down a good level track that appeared between the bushes in abrupt and, or so it seemed to me, miraculous fashion. In fact, I am sure Bullet had found this path long ago and very carefully cleared it. I don't know what my face revealed after this little incident, but when Bullet and Patricia saw my expression, they exchanged conspiratorial glances. Then Bullet leaned down and whispered in the little girl's ear. Patricia nodded vigorously, and her eyes sparkled with mischief. The car climbed back up the slope down which we had driven into the valley of the elephants, and emerged on an open plateau, studded with patches of bush. Bullet drove to the edge of this expanse of dry grass and slowed down. Out in the open, the sun full upon them, there lay side by side what looked like 3 huge logs of wood with gray, wrinkled bark. What storm or tornado had been violent enough to pick them up and fling them into the very middle of this bare savanna? I put the question to Bullet. He made no reply, merely drove forward, slower and slower, in the direction of these blasted trunks, his lips a thin, concentrated line. Suddenly, something stirred at the extreme end of one log, and revealed itself as a head, a squarish rough-hewn, nightmare head, its chunky lines spoiled by great warlike protuberances, and which terminated in a massive, backward-curving horn. The other 2 logs now came to life in the same horrible fashion, and 3 rhinos lay there, motionless, watching the car. At this, Bullet began to drive round and round the 3 great beasts, tightening his circle a little each time. The first one got heavily to its feet, followed by the second, and then the third. They backed together till their cruppers were touching, and each of them facing a different point of the compass. The coarse texture of their bodies and their queerly primitive shape suggested that they had been fashioned out of great gray boulders, all seamed with cracks and hollows, heaped together in haphazard patterns. During the final moments of their creation, the rhinos swung their horrible horned heads round, first in one direction, then another. Their small squinting eyes, half hidden behind heavy folds of skin, found our car and stayed fixed on it, and us. I heard Patricia whisper, "Don't you recognize the big one, the one with the scar on his back? I showed him to you down at the pool the other morning." She was quite right, but I did not get the chance to think about the coincidence then. Bullet had already started circling in on this sculptured, apocalyptic group. A long, unpleasant, drawn-out hissing sound came from their vast nostrils. All the time, the distance between the monsters and ourselves was lessening. "Look at our old friend there," Patricia exclaimed. "He's the fiercest and worst-tempered rhino I know. Look out, he's going to charge." And indeed, while her voice still echoed in the air, the great beast plunged forward at us. All other emotions were driven out of my head by sheer astonishment. I would never have credited that such a huge, bulky body, supported on those squat and seemingly deformed legs, could move so suddenly and so fast. But Bullet was ready for it. His foot went down on the accelerator, and with one hand he wrenched the steering wheel round. Even so, the rhino only just missed us. It shot past the open Land Rover like a rock from a catapult, and so close that I heard its furious hissing breath as it passed. Was I frightened? It was impossible to tell. Everything happened so quickly and abruptly. Then the 2 other rhinos charged as well, with their angry, lowered heads menacing us from every side, The Land Rover swerved on two wheels, dodged back on its tracks, spun round, and bounced about over the rough ground. One false move, or any sign of engine failure, and we would have been done for, pierced, impaled, eviscerated by those murderous horns. But Bullet fought this corrida with immense panache and confidence. The Rangers yelled their delight, and Patricia laughed out loud, the kind of wonderful, clear laughter you hear in a circus, rising up like a happy peal of bells from packed rows of excited children. The animals tired quicker than the Land Rover. One after another, the three rhinos abandoned their attack. They stood together in a group, blown, their flanks heaving enormously, their short, massive legs trembling under them. But those terrible horns still pointed menacingly toward us. "Cheerio for now, chums," Bullet shouted. As he drove away from the rhinos grazing ground, his voice and expression alike seemed far younger and more healthily relaxed than usual. His natural audacity led him to court these encounters. His skill carried him safely through them, and afterward he appeared positively refreshed. The incident, I thought, suggested some driving psychological need, which grew no less exigent with the passage of time. The warden of the national park, no less than Bull Bullet, had to give rein to it. The only difference was that now, instead of a gun, he used an all-purpose vehicle. I asked him if he never carried a gun. Bullet said, "I don't even own one now." I recalled that in the house of this former professional hunter, neither guns nor trophies were to be seen anywhere. "I'm not allowed to," Bullet added gently. He took one hand from the steering wheel and stroked his daughter's cropped hair. Then Patricia stretched out her arm in an impulsive and heartfelt gesture, plunged her fingers into Bullet's thick reddish thatch. I couldn't help reflecting that she treated King's mane in precisely the same way, pulled his head close to hers, and rubbed her cheek against his. At this moment, they both looked immensely happy. The car moved on, slowly now, and apparently at random. Once again the surrounding countryside became thick with antelope, zebra, ostriches, and buffalo. Several times Patricia got out of the car and went among the animals on foot. From where we sat, she glimmered in the middle distance, her pale, washed-out blue overalls giving her an oddly insubstantial quality. This impression was heightened by the way she passed through these herds of wild creatures without evoking in them any trace of fear, disturbance, or even surprise. She lingered longest in a certain hollow dell, where some underground flow of water produced lusher, greener grass, and round which grew a few trees that bore not thorns, but tender leaves. Here there were more animals than elsewhere, and they seemed more contented. From the little knoll where Bullet had stopped the car, we could observe every movement that both she and her wild companions made. Only the easy, unthinking innocence with which they accepted her could match her display of exactly similar qualities as she moved among them. Antelopes would come up and nuzzle at her shoulder. Buffaloes sniffed her up and down in an amicable fashion. One particular zebra persisted in frisking round her and showing off for her benefit. Patricia talked to them all. "She knows the master words," Bullet said to me in a low voice. "In which language?" I asked. "Let's see. Wakamba, Jaholo, Kipsikwi, Samburu, and Masai," Bullet replied. "She learned them from Kihoro and the rangers, not to mention itinerant sorcerers down in the native village." "Do you really believe in such things?" "I'm a white man and a Christian," Bullet said, "but there are some things I've seen." He shook his head. "Anyway," he said softly, "there's no doubt about it as far as the kid's concerned. She'd talk just as easily with elephants or rhinos." Perhaps they were both right. This was a region into which my experience could not reach. But after the morning I had just spent with Bullet and Patricia, I was convinced that the child's essential power derived partly from an overwhelmingly strong inherited instinct, and partly from the lessons her father had learned during 20 years in the bush. Along with her fairy stories and lullabies, she had imbibed knowledge of the lives and moods of wild animals. She had benefited from his vast experience of hunting and stalking. Almost from birth she had known the smell of jungle and savanna, and the wild beast lairs they contained. And from her earliest days, Bullet had represented in Patricia's eyes both the great beast who roamed the national park, and at the same time the man who was their master. Bemused with pleasure, Bullet watched his slender, delicate daughter wandering unharmed among the denizens of the bush. He knew, I was convinced of this, that the gentle authority which Patricia exercised over all these animals had come to be the only way left to him, since he had renounced the hunter's trade, of still mastering and possessing that strange, untamed, and noble race of creatures with whom he had bound up his life. It was a curious transmission of authority through blood kinship. No closer or more tender relationship could have been conceived than that which existed between Bullet and Patricia. Their natures differed radically, yet each had a complementary part to play in an alliance as natural and precious to both of them as the very air they breathed. This fact must surely explain the incident which took place very shortly afterward, when a raw, primitive need makes itself felt. It leaves nothing to mere chance. Chapter 9. No, indeed, chance played no part in this encounter. Bullet knew very well. Indeed, he had told me so himself, that King could smell the Land Rover from miles away, and would come chasing across country to greet him, and Bullet ought to be aware, since such knowledge formed part of his professional skill. Just where a full-grown lion was liable to be found in the bush, spring, summer, autumn, or winter. I noticed, too, that when we reached a certain long stretch of open country, Bullet craned his neck and stared out over the windshield. beneath those shaggy auburn brows, his hunter's eyes, well used to noticing the smallest details of the landscape, were concentrating attentively on a distant thicket, which lay beyond the savannah across which we were now driving. Then he smiled, and gently nudged Patricia with one elbow. It was now I saw a speck suddenly detach itself from the thicket and move in our direction. The speck became a blob, and the blob swelled into a great tawny lion. "King," Patricia called. "Daddy, it's King. It really is." Bullet was smiling gently. It was in the natural order of things that this morning of perfect friendship between Patricia and himself should culminate in the most welcome surprise he could possibly have devised for her. "When did you discover he was living up here?" Patricia asked him excitedly. "Only yesterday. I'd had 3 rangers tracking him ever since he decamped from his old haunts. Yesterday, Mina and Kipsigui." Bullet jerked his head back toward the youngest of the native guards, sitting in the back. "Mina came and brought me the news." Bullet put his strong, heavy arm around the child's neck. "I wanted you to be with me when we followed up his report." "King! King!" shouted Patricia, bouncing up and down on the seat. The great lion came bounding up at full speed, growling happily, his mane flying out behind him. Just as he was about to reach the Land Rover, however, Patricia said, "Make him run a bit longer, Daddy, as fast as he can. He looks so wonderful then." Bullet twisted the steering wheel round sharply and swerved away in such a fashion that the lion was no longer in front of us, but on one flank. Then he began to drive at a speed that would strain King to the uttermost of his power and wind, yet not outdistance him altogether. King began to run after us, bounding along exactly like some gigantic dog, a nightmare hound dreamed up for the end of the world. Like a dog, too, he was yapping with excitement. The only difference was that when he yapped, the whole bush trembled. In this fashion, we drove 3 times in succession, all around that big stretch of savannah. We could see terrified animals scuttling away into the distance on all sides, and high above us, thinking no doubt that this game of ours was a chase to the death. It certainly both looked and sounded exactly like it. The vultures had begun to gather, wings outspread against the sun. King's pace did not slacken, nor the volume of his roaring diminish, but now his open jaws were heavily flecked with foam. Patricia sat down and laid one hand on Bullet's arm. It was as though they were both driving in unison. The car slowed down and came to a halt. The next moment, King had caught up with us. He rose erect on his hind legs, a paw on each of Bullet's shoulders, and then, panting hoarsely with exhaustion and delight, rubbed his muzzle against the face of this man who had protected him long ago when he was still a cub, Bullet's red hair and King's tawny mane blended into one. Honestly, it looks just like two lions, doesn't it? Patricia said in a soft whisper. But King had heard her. He stretched out one paw. It was as delicate and well cushioned as a gigantic sponge, and placed it behind the little girl's neck. Then he drew her head close to Bullet's, and with a single sweep of his tongue licked both their faces simultaneously. This done, he slid down to the ground again, and his golden eyes scrutinized all the other passengers in the car. Each one of them was familiar to him. Kahoro, the rangers, myself. Reassured, he turned his attention back to Bullet, and Bullet, it was plain, knew exactly what the lion was waiting for. He slowly opened the car door, swung his long legs out in a leisurely fashion, and strolled round to where King was. Then, standing foursquare in front of the great beast, he said, with deliberate emphasis, "Want to see who's tougher, eh, old boy? Like we used to do in the good old days. That's it, isn't it?" King's eyes were fixed steadily on Bullet. The left one was somewhat more narrowed than the right, a mere slit in fact, and this made it appear as though the lion was winking. Furthermore, he punctuated each of Bullet's sentences with a very gentle growl. King, it was clear, understood. "Right, old boy," Bullet abruptly exclaimed. "Ready now." He sprang forward at King. The lion reared to its full height on its hind legs, and wound both front paws round Bullet's neck. This time the gesture was very far from a caress. King was exerting his strength against Bullet, trying to throw him backward, and Bullet, likewise, was straining to get King off balance. Under King's tawny hide, I could see the great sinews ripple and contract. On Bullet's massive neck and forearms, he was built like a prize athlete. The muscles and tendons stood out thick as ropes. Strength and balance were evenly matched. Neither King nor Bullet yielded an inch. Obviously, if the lion had chosen to let himself go, or had been driven by a sudden burst of temper to throw the full power of his great chest and loins into the struggle, Bullet, for all his astounding physique, could not have held out against him for one moment. But King knew, just as surely as Bullet did, that this was a game. Moreover, just as a little while before Bullet had driven the Land Rover at the precise speed which marked the limit of King's endurance, so now the great lion exerted just enough of his terrible strength to balance Bullet's own efforts. Then Bullet changed his tactics. He hooked his right leg round one of King's paws and jerked sharply, shouting as he did so, "Well, what do you make of that trick, eh?" Man and lion rolled over and over together in the dust. A confused struggle now took place, punctuated by growls and laughter. When the dust cleared, there was Bullet flat on his back, with King crouching on his chest. While Bullet was getting his breath back, King waited patiently, and his narrowed, half-shut eye seemed gently to mock his human adversary. Suddenly, with one heaving twist of his body, Bullet rolled over onto his stomach, drew up his knee under him, placed both hands flat on the ground, palms down, and having thus obtained a purchase, began to arc his back. Little by little, in a series of titanic heaves, he lifted the lion of Kilimanjaro clear off the ground, paws dangling. King let Bullet do as he would. "Bravo, Daddy! Well done!" Patricia cried, and the two rangers clapped their hands. Only Kahoro remained silent. Indeed, he actually turned his back on the demonstration and began to stare with great concentration at the wedge-shaped clump of tall trees on the edge of the bush where King had first appeared. Somehow Bullet seemed to have observed his preoccupation. He shook King off and rose to his feet, then head thrown back and the sun's rays beating down on his upturned face. He began to work his shoulders about, stretching his arms and hollowing his back. Every muscle in his body must have been aching, every joint bruised and agonized. Yet he was laughing out of sheer happiness. His animal strength and natural violence had at last fulfilled themselves triumphantly, and Patricia had been there to see it. "Well done, old boy," he said to King, and shook him playfully by the mane. "Let me have him," cried Patricia. "It's my turn now." She was on the point of jumping out of the car when Kahoro's black, withered hand caught her and held her back. At the same instant, a loud roar filled the air, followed almost at once by another. They both came from that three-cornered clump of trees, and then the bushes, which the old tracker had been studying so carefully a moment before. It was impossible, even for so inexperienced an ear as mine, to mistake their tone. These were not the cheerful, friendly growls that I had learned to recognize from my encounters with King. What I heard now was that harsh, guttural, rumbling roar which rises in the throat of some great carnivore when it is aroused to a murderous fury, a menacing sound that can make even the bravest of hearts miss a beat. Two lionesses padded out of the undergrowth, huge beasts with superb glossy coats, their tails switching from flank to flank like great flails, their jaws snarling open as they roared again at King. Behind them came a string of young cubs. If I at once grasped the full significance of this tableau, it was entirely due to the expression which I saw appear on Patricia's face. Her features, ordinarily so mobile and sensitive, froze into a rigid, secretive mask. They seemed gripped, almost disfigured by some revolting and morbid agony of the emotions. One thing, and one thing only, could make any face as ugly as this: a frantic degree of jealousy. There was, too, only one reason why Patricia should be afflicted, and afflicted so strangely, by this particular emotion. The two lionesses were King's wives, and had come to summon him back to them. King understood this as soon as Patricia did. His eyes shifted from Bullet to Patricia, and from Patricia to the angry lionesses. He shook his mane indecisively. Patricia half opened her mouth to speak to him, and he turned his head in her direction. If she had ordered him to stay, there is no doubt he would have stayed. But Patricia's eyes were bright with anger and hurt pride, and the words remained unspoken. So King moved away from her, back to his imperious and demanding wives. At first, as though to show us politeness, he went at a slow, dignified walk, but as the distance between us increased, so his pace quickened. Finally, he broke into a run, and was soon reunited with his family. They all disappeared into the bush. Bullet got back into the driving seat and started the car. In an awkward voice, a strained, artificial smile on his face, he said, "Well, Pat, we had some good fun there, didn't we?" The child made no reply. Bullet turned the car to the left and made straight for the edge of the jungle. "We'll get back as quickly as we can now," he told me. He was talking as though his one subject was to keep himself from having to think. "Down at the farthest corner of that stretch of forest," he went on, "we can join a good track going south. I cleared it not so long ago. That takes us to the open country where you saw the manyatta built, and after that it's only a short hop home, to a good long tot of Scotch." By now, the edge of the bush was well behind us, and Bullet uttered a deep sigh of relief. But just as he was about to turn off down the track he had described, Patricia grasped his wrist and told him to stop. Bullet stared at her uncomprehendingly. "Stop, I tell you, or I'll jump out of the car anyway, while it's still moving." Patricia was struggling to control her voice, but there was a hysterical note in it that made me shiver. It reminded me of Sybil just before one of her crisis de nerfs. Bullet did as she ordered. She was out of the car and on the ground in a flash. Without even bothering to open the door, Bullet made as though to follow her. "No," Patricia said, in the same strained voice. "I don't want anyone with me. I don't need anyone to protect me in this reserve." Her hot, feverish eyes met mine. Then she added, as though only half aware of what she was saying, "Oh, yes, you can come if you like." It was impossible to tell from her voice whether this offer was prompted by contemptuous indifference or a genuine, if vague, feeling of friendliness. "Please go with her," Bullet whispered. I got out of the car. Patricia told her father to leave us, and Bullet at once put the Land Rover into gear and drove off. Patricia plunged into the thorny undergrowth. Before I set off after her, I glanced back just long enough to see a black and crippled body slip noiselessly from the car and at once flatten itself on the ground. Here the trees grew thickly, and the gaps between their trunks were filled with spiky bushes, which held up Patricia's progress. This secretly delighted me. It meant that Kehoro would have time to catch up on our tracks, a comforting if invisible shadow. But now Patricia broke out of the jungle and moved rapidly along its verge. When we came within sight of the wedge-shaped thicket that concealed King's family den, she said to me, "Go back among the trees. Lions won't attack anyone in thick forest, or if they do, they are very clumsy about it. Quickly now, I want to be left in peace." Patricia began to run through the brushwood, and never stopped till she was out on the open plain. The sun shone full on her face as she stood staring at the thicket. Then she cupped her hand to her mouth like a trumpet, and uttered the same extraordinary cry that I had heard Kehoro use to summon King. Two short, sharp roars came from the thicket, and then both the lionesses burst out through the bushes, hair bristling and jaws wide open. A single bound would carry them to Patricia's side. What was Kehoro doing? Why was he still waiting? But then came another, deeper roar, so powerful that it obliterated every other sound within earshot. With one enormous bound, King cleared the bushes and placed himself exactly where he had intended, between his infuriated wives and Patricia. The bigger of the two lionesses, who was also both stronger and handsomer than her companion, now sprang to one side in an attempt to turn King's flank. King leaped forward and sent her sprawling back. She instantly returned to the attack. Once again, King barred her path, and this time his great paw, with all claws bared, raked down across the big lioness's neck, ripping through skin and flesh. Blood spurted out on the tawny hide, and the wounded beast retreated, howling with pain and humiliation. King pressed her back farther still, growling horribly, till, step by step, she was forced into the shelter of the bushes again. The other lioness had already gone to ground there. Once again that strangely modulated call rose through the burning air of the savannah. King now turned back toward Patricia. She had not moved. She was trembling a little. I saw this when she raised one hand and placed it on King's head, in the space between his great golden eyes. Then the trembling ceased, and the little girl's fingers moved gently to and fro over the lion's skin. King now lay down, and Patricia curled up in the hollow formed by his belly and paws. She put out a finger and touched the paw that still bore traces of fresh blood, and her eyes blazed defiance at the thorny barrier behind which King's wives lay, moaning softly to themselves, beaten and ashamed. Then even these hoarse complaints died away. The lionesses had resigned themselves to their lot. Once again, a crushing noonday silence reigned over the savannah. I am quite certain that without the sudden return of that extraordinary and absolute stillness, I would never have noticed the sound that now put me on alert. It was very faint, barely perceptible, a tiny rasp of metal against a tree trunk. I stooped between the bushes to see where this odd little noise came from. In the refracted half-light that filtered through the undergrowth, I suddenly caught the iridescent gleam of an iron spear. Its point was propped against the trunk of a big tree, and beside it I saw what looked like a copper-colored helmet. It was in fact the dressed hair of Orunga, the moraine. He was watching Patricia. His fierce, proud face was so still that he might have been carved out of black marble. At this instant, he was conscious of nothing except the small white girl, asleep there between the paws of a lion. His spear had dropped from his hand. He took no trouble to conceal himself. He clearly did not care if he was seen or not. Patricia slept on, her head pillowed by King's body. Chapter 10. The afternoon was nearly over by the time we got back. "Cheer up," Patricia said gaily. "We're almost there now." And indeed, as she spoke, I caught sight of the only group of trees in the reserve which I could be sure of identifying, those in whose shade stood some of the flimsy buildings constructed for human habitation. It was high time, too, that I returned to the amenities of civilization. Both my muscles and nerves had come to the end of their tether. The journey back from King's new home had taken nearly 4 hours, an endless march through thorny jungle, through the dust and heat of the day. Yet Patricia had done it without any visible strain. Sometimes she would race on ahead, singing at the top of her voice. Sometimes she would hold my hand as though to spur me on to fresh efforts. Her friendship with me had moved on to a deeper level of truth. In a way, its very substance had been transformed. I had been a witness, the only witness, as she supposed, of her triumphant revenge. At regular intervals, she would repeat, always in the same exultant voice, "You saw what happened, didn't you? You saw what happened." The rest of the time, we walked on in silence, Patricia brooding over her victory, I thinking of the moraine. Just how and why had it happened that Orunga came to be in exactly the right place, at exactly the right time, to catch Patricia at her unnerving and hazardous sport? Had he accidentally stumbled on King's lair while trekking across the reserve? It was possible. The Menyatta was not far away. Perhaps ever since then he had set himself to stalk the great beast, dreaming of those not-so-distant days when, by immemorial tradition, a tradition which had all the compelling force of a myth, every adult Maasai male was under an obligation to hunt and kill his lion. What was the meaning of the way he had stared at Patricia, his eyes fixed and blazing? All the time she lay between King's paws, up to the very moment when she said goodbye to him. Patricia might well have been able to enlighten me on the subject, but she was unaware that Orunga had seen her, and a curious fear, somewhat akin to superstitious terror, prevented me from telling her. "Well, we've made it anyway," Patricia said, laughing, though not unkindly, at my exhausted appearance. We had actually reached the native village. From here, the path forked off in two directions, one branch leading to Bullet's bungalow, the other, which was much shorter, to the visitor's compound, where I was staying. Patricia halted at this fork, apparently in some indecision. She bent her head slightly and began to trace geometrical patterns in the dust with the toe of her shoe. An unexpected air of timidity was visible in her expression, yet only a little while before she had fearlessly faced two angry lionesses. "If you aren't too awfully tired," she said at last, in a low, diffident voice, "would you like to come back home with me? I should be jolly glad if you would. If you're there, Mummy won't get in one of her tempers. The thing is, I'm dreadfully late." Then Patricia raised her head and said brightly, "Look, I'm not asking you to do this for me. It's for her sake. When she gets cross, it makes her, well, ill, you know." Whether my influence was in fact as great as Patricia made it out to be, or whether Bullet had cooked up some polite fiction to excuse his daughter's absence, I do not know. Whichever it was, Sybil welcomed us in the most charming possible manner. Then she sent Patricia off to take a shower, and as soon as she was gone, said to me, "I very much want to have a private talk with you. It would be easier over at my bungalow." "Excellent," said Sybil, and smiled. "I'll drop in on you one of these days." When I reached my own bungalow, I flung myself straight down on the camp bed and fell into an exhausted, feverish sleep. When I woke, it was quite dark. I felt worried and depressed, and hardly inclined to prolong a visit which no longer served any useful purpose. My curiosity had been gratified beyond all reasonable expectation. I knew everything there was to know about King's life and his relationship with Patricia. Indeed, the huge lion had become a familiar figure to me. Now I could and should depart with an easy mind. But how will it all end? I suddenly asked myself, and thought, I must stay to the end. I got up and began irritably pacing up and down the veranda. Why should there be an end, and of what nature? Was I waiting to see Kahoro shoot Urunga, or the Moraine run his spear through the old tracker, or Bullet ripped up by a rhino, or King, the rules of the game suddenly forgotten, tearing Patricia limb from limb, or Sybil going mad? All these notions were at once distasteful and absurd. I was losing all sense of proportion. I ought to get out of this place as soon as I could, and put its inhabitants, both animal and human, far behind me. But I knew I would stay in the reserve till the end, because, though I could not explain my absolute certainty, I knew that an end there would be, a climax, a denouement of some sort. I lit my hurricane lamp and went in search of a bottle of whiskey. Later, very much later, I had drunk enough to put me to sleep again. A tiny, velvety paw gently lifted one of my eyelids. I saw a monkey, about the size of a large coconut, sitting beside my pillow, with a black, silky mask on his face. It was an exact repetition of my first awakening in the reserve. The same half-light, the same scatter of bush shirt and slacks thrown down in a heap at the end of my bed, beside the hurricane lamp, which just as before was still burning. Just as I had done then, too, I now walked out onto the veranda, and there I found Cymbeline, the little gazelle whose hooves were no bigger than dice, and whose horns were like pine needles. And the same mist veiled the big clearing, which led down to the mysterious pool. Yes, everything was as it had been on that first occasion, but now the magic had lost its power over me. There was no longer any poetry or mystery about Nicholas and Cymbeline. I knew in advance every detail and contour of the landscape before the mist revealed it. In short, my feelings were not more than the calcined ashes of that miraculous wonder I had previously experienced. But the dawn came up again, in all its instantaneous splendor. The snows of Kilimanjaro flushed warmly crimson, like coals glowing evenly in a brazier. The mist shredded away into fairy ribbons and a sparkling powder of crushed diamonds. Down below the tall grasses, a gleam of water appeared, and the wild animals began to weave their vast living tapestry at the foot of the great mountain. Then all this natural beauty regained its pristine freshness in my eyes. It became new once more, as it had been on that unique morning when I first discovered it. Though nature might monotonously repeat her miracles, indifferent to beauty, that beauty itself lost nothing of its magnificence and perfection. Once more I was torn by a desire to share the freedom and innocence which were the prerogative of all wild creatures. I felt the need no less urgently than I had on first setting foot in the reserve. I had not truly satisfied it in any respect during my stay. I dressed and went out, following the edge of the forest. I seemed to be moving in a kind of waking dream. I felt that everything would begin again, that all the events of that first morning were about to repeat themselves. This impression was so strong that when I reached the point at which I had come out from the cover of the trees, I paused for a moment, listening for Patricia's voice, and then I heard it. She said, "You mustn't go any further. It's not allowed." Precisely because I had been half expecting it, this flat, toneless whisper surprised and terrified me far more than it had done on that other morning, when it had come out of the blue at me. This was too extraordinary to be a mere coincidence. It must be a hallucination, produced by my own distraught mind. But when I turned round, there stood the same small girl in gray overalls, with her bowl-shaped haircut, leaning against the same tree as before. The only difference was that this time she was laughing. "It's plain witchcraft," I said. "First Nicholas, and Cymbeline, now you." Patricia's silent laughter doubled in intensity. A delightful mischievous spark was dancing in her eyes. "I thought you'd never guess," she said. "Yes, I sent them to wake you. I knew that would bring you out here." I laughed noiselessly, as she had done, Then together we stood and watched the animals. By the great pitted scar on his back, I recognized the rhinoceros that had charged our car. I reflected that the young zebra, rolling his stripy flanks to and fro in the muddy grass beside the pool, might well be the brother of the one that the cheetah's cubs had devoured. And as I watched the buffaloes grazing, I thought of that other buffalo who had made his last charge with King on his back, throttling the life out of him. Many other reflections, whole sequences of related images, now came into my mind. I told them all to Patricia, and she listened attentively, adding an occasional word of approval, correction, or explanation. Suddenly, she said to me, very seriously, "I was wondering just what you do with your life in the ordinary way." "I travel," I told her, "and observe things. It's extremely entertaining." "I don't doubt it," Patricia said, "but is that all?" "No. Afterward, I write a book." "What about?" "Everything I've seen on my latest trip." "Why?" she inquired. "For the benefit of people who can't travel themselves." "I see." She frowned slightly. Then she nodded toward the beast and said, "Are you going to write about them?" "I don't think so." "You are quite right not to. You wouldn't know how." "I've learned that already," I said. "How?" "Through you," I said. Patricia gave me a small friendly smile and took my hand. "You'd have to come back on many more visits over a long period," she said. "Then perhaps—" She laughed again. "I must go and talk to my friends now. Wait for me here." She slipped away, a slim, fragile gray ghost, threading her way among the bushes and puddles and tall grasses to whisper the master words in the ears of the beasts that lived below Kilimanjaro. I leaned against a tree and fixed my eyes on the dawn-red snows that gleamed from the mountain peak. After a few moments' contemplation, I lowered my gaze to see if I could spot Patricia. I made her out quite easily. She had not yet reached the vast gathering of animals. And then I nearly cried out in terror. Close behind the girl, a dark, slender shape was writhing swiftly through the grass. It had a flat, triangular head that gleamed in the morning sunlight. Did Patricia's spellbinding powers extend to reptiles? And could Kahoro, even if he were the best shot in the world, be sure of hitting this furtive, coiling target? I was on the verge of panicking, shouting to the old tracker, running toward Patricia, doing God knows what, but Patricia stopped near a gazelle, and slowly the black figure rose erect, and revealed itself as a handsome, naked man, armed with a spear, and crowned with a tall, clay-colored helmet of plaited hair. I shouted, "Patricia, look behind you, Urunga." Perhaps my voice failed, or the wind was against me, but in any case, Patricia didn't hear my warning. Its only effect was to scare a troop of antelope and a family of zebra that were passing close by me. And in any case, it was already too late. The moraine was at Patricia's side. I held my breath, but nothing untoward happened. Orunga and the small girl merely continued their walk together. Orunga, too, was used to the company of wild animals. Perhaps he too knew the master words. The sun was a good deal higher in the sky when Patricia returned, and it was beginning to get really hot. She laughed and asked me if I had seen the moraine. Yes, I said, my throat still dry. Well, he spent the night in the bush outside our bungalow, watching to see when I went out, Patricia said. Why? To make sure of following me and talking to me. What did he want, I asked. To find out whether I was the big lion's daughter or an ordinary sorcerer, Patricia said, and burst out laughing again. What did you say? I told him to guess. She looked at me with the ghost of a wink and added, You knew he was lurking around near King's Den yesterday, didn't you? And that he saw the whole business with the lionesses. I admitted it. Why didn't you tell me earlier? She asked. I said nothing. Patricia winked the other eye. Oh, I see, she said. You were scared of him and didn't want to frighten me. But you're wrong, of course. He couldn't touch me. After all, I'm a white woman. She abruptly bent double, choking with laughter, an uncomfortable business for her, since because of the animals, she had to hold it back and keep silent. When she had managed to get herself under control, she added, He asked for my hand in marriage. Go on, what did you say? I advised him to discuss the matter with King. I did not want to admit to myself just what the full implications of that remark might be. I merely said, I don't understand. It's very simple, really. I told this moraine the exact spot where I see King every day. I also told him that he would never dare to go there unarmed. At this point, Patricia shook her head gravely. King hates natives who carry spears. He probably knows that his parents were killed by some men. I exclaimed, But you told me yourself that the Maasai had an almost lunatic pride. Well, what about it? Said the child with a nicely calculated air of ingenuousness. Orunga has no option but to turn up now. You think so, Patricia said. Her voice was as innocent and demure as ever, but this time she winked both eyes, one after the other, and Orunga came. We hardly settled down under that shady tree in King's company. By now he treated me as an old friend, before the moraine appeared from behind a clump of scrub and walked toward us. No doubt he had been spying on us for some time. He was naked, except for the fold of gray cloth which he carried over one shoulder. At each step he took, his whole body was exposed. The great lion growled, deep in his throat, and his yellow eyes fixed themselves in an angry stare on Orunga. he had taken an instantaneous dislike to this unknown native with the coppery head-dress, who walked with such arrogance and stared back at him with such defiant contempt. King turned his head to Patricia as though asking her advice. "Stay where you are," the child told him. King continued to growl, but did not budge. Orunga came in under the shade of the spreading branches, passing so close to the lion that the edge of his fluttering wrap brushed against King's muzzle, and leaned indolently against the trunk of the tree. Patricia got up, and so did King, but as she kept one hand on his huge neck under the mane, the lion permitted her to lead him slowly toward the moraine. They stopped about 3 paces away from him. He stood absolutely still and looked them over. Beneath the casque of clay-plastered hair, he held his head high and straight. King's great jaws opened, and his incisors gleamed. He pawed the ground with one forefoot, baring all his claws. Orunga smiled contemptuously. Then, just as she had done with me, Patricia set King at the moraine and held him in at the last moment. This process she repeated several times, but on this occasion the lion was not roaring and working himself up into a blind rage simply to please a little girl, but for his own satisfaction. With every instinct he possessed, he hated Orunga. It almost looked as though the very scent of the man who stood before him, leaning against a tree trunk, epitomized the entire race of warriors who had been the lion's sworn enemies since time immemorial. Patricia had to exert every last ounce of her authority over King to keep his temper under control. Throughout this series of abortive attacks, when King's jaws were often a bare inch away from Orunga's throat, and the moraine could feel the lion's hot breath on his face, not a single muscle so much as stirred on his dark young athlete's body, and his haughty features never flinched. Perhaps Orunga was confident in the assurance that the little white girl would protect him whatever happened. Perhaps his was merely the courage of insensate pride, or perhaps, and this seemed nearer the truth, it was something beyond either reason, courage, or pride, an unformulated yet binding allegiance to his tribal myths, to the numberless, ageless ghost of all the moraines the Maasai people had ever known, each one of them a lion killer or slain by a lion himself. I could not tear my eyes away from Orunga. I was afraid, yet not for him. After what I had seen of Patricia's powers, I felt that in the wild beast domain everything was possible and permissible for her. But I now saw very clearly that beasts alone were no longer sufficient for her private game. She was feeling the need to bring men into it as well, to extend her authority simultaneously over the 2 mutually forbidden kingdoms. Suddenly, Orunga raised his right arm and spoke a few words in an abrupt, uncouth fashion. "He wants to go," Patricia said. "He refuses to be made a plaything, even for a lion. King bristled and growled as Orunga passed him. Patricia had to hold on to his mane with all her strength. Then the native warrior moved away, his gait springy and nonchalant as ever. When he came to the end of the shadow cast by the tree's spreading branches, he turned and spoke again. He says, Patricia informed me, that next time he will bring his spear. Long after the moraine had vanished in the bush, the huge lion was still trembling with fury. It was not till Patricia stretched herself out between his paws, with her head resting on his breast, that he at last calmed down.